All right. Our next speaker is Christopher Witter. Christopher's had quite a career over about, I think, almost 2 decades that he's been in security and incident response. He's held leadership roles with CSIRTs in large financial institutions and defense contractors. And he was one of the founding members of CrowdStrike's Falcon Overwatch managed threat hunting service. Chris right now leads the detection and response efforts for Spotify, and today he's here to mine some of that expertise for us and tell about some of the common mistakes and misconceptions he's seen people have about threat hunting. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Awesome, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so David already did a quick about me. The only two things he left off were I'm a huge nerd when it comes to DFAR space. I love threat hunting, but also I'm a gigantic outdoor enthusiast and I love making things. So if you follow me on Twitter, in the end, you'll see a kind of a mixture of all those components. Let's jump in. So first, even though some of the other people have already said it, I'm going to give a quick definition for threat hunting or what I think it is. And basically, we're looking for finding or uncovering previously unidentified intrusions or TTPs methodically in ways that our security operations are not. Because if our security operations were able to do this, it would be an alert, it would be a detection, someone else would be doing it, and it would be manual at all. Why are we doing this? We're doing it to minimize dwell time, and we have to keep that in mind. And at the same time, we're also trying to discover new ways for detecting those intruders and their activities, which may be as a result of an investigation. So first, let's talk about the baseline fallacy. So this is a common misconception that I often run into back when I was working at an MSSP, when I was at CrowdStrike. We get questions of, how are you going to baseline our information? What are you going to know what good really is? And it's really difficult to explain until you've gone through the motions and done it. But if you think that you have to establish a baseline first, even in the keynote, it was established like, how do you know that when you do your baseline, you're not actually already infected? In which case, then you may actually have a faulty baseline. So that's kind of not a great approach to take. We need to build this into our hunting processes. We'll kind of look at what we need to do that instead. It should be part of our hunt, not as an outside process. So if not a baseline, then what? I like this awesome quote from Ian Fleming from the James Bond movie Goldfinger. Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. I already had the rule of 3s when I stumbled upon this. I wanted to find something to kind of send it home because once, of course, could just be like, well, it's unique, it's an anomaly, no big deal, whatever. Twice if it happens, well, was that just a coincidence that it happened 2 times? But 3 times you kind of start to establish some sort of pattern there. And this pattern 3 times doesn't necessarily mean it's malicious activity. It could simply be a user's activity or something that happens patternistically. So for the rule of 3s, I like to say 3 days. It happens 1 day, and that happens 2 days, 3 days. We need to have that level of data to go back and look. And this kind of goes to some of the later things we'll talk about. 3 weeks, 3 months, or fiscal quarters. So Craig actually mentioned it, and that was kind of awesome to hear that he brought up fiscal quarters. Something that happens once, 1 fiscal quarter, that's a long period of time in between. We're talking 3 months. So I need 3 months of data to establish, is this a pattern? Is this normal? I need 3 quarters worth of data to establish like, hey, yeah, this is normal and not waste my time potentially, or this is an activity that I need to go in and look at more. So it's not only enough to have the data to see it once, you have to be able to see it multiple times. Otherwise, you're just you may be chasing your tail going, yeah, this looks bad. And then come to find out that it is indeed something that's normal. And so a great example and something I think everybody can take and absorb and think through. So let's take an example as an Office application. We see our EDR system hits and says, hey, this is spawning a command prompt, which users then executing FTP commands. Okay, 1 day, that's kind of sketchy. Your spidey senses tingling. You're like, this is not good, right? But now you look back another 30 days, and this activity has happened twice. Okay, that's cool. Look back over again 3 months because it's only happened once. And then 30 days later, it happens again. 30 days later than that, we're at like the 90-day mark here. It's happened 3 times. Now let's add some context to that, and we'll talk more about context later as well. So it just so happens that it happened 3 times. But what if I told you that user was not a technical user? You'd probably be really worried. What if I told you they were in accounting? What if I then told you are in finance? You start adding that context. These 3 times now start to be like, well, either A, this is weird, and there's just some bad business practices here. This is just an anomaly that happens. This application does this weird thing, but taking into account it's once a month now because we've seen it 3 months in a row. Person's in accounting, you reach out to them. Oh, guess what? Yeah, that's a payroll process because payroll gets maybe done once a month at your organization. So that rule of 3s allowed us to kind of go, okay, if it happened once, yeah, I should probably be concerned. Twice, maybe not. But the same could be said for something that happens multiple times with maybe not a similar periodicity, but something that happens at an irregular interval could be C2 beaconing. But if it happens more than once, you kind of got my attention. Otherwise, if it happens once in my data set and how much data I have, I may be able to give that a good acceptance as, okay, this is normal, or I may be distracted and be like, not so much. We need to dig further. So another misconception, and this one is probably tremendous for our industry as data volumes have just increased and the cloud has made it easier in services that we have, but I must have all my data in my SIM. I think it's a really great idea because you can't correlate on things you don't have access to within the environment with which you're writing your rules and information, right? And that's difficult to do. There are things that we can do to get around that. They're not as great, but we also have to bear in mind too, not all SIMs are created equal, we'll say. As your data volumes increase, your query times may increase significantly. Your query times may fail. You may pay per node. You may pay per ingest. So your scope in financial costs and also maybe computational costs grows up exponentially. So we have to be careful there. So I have a few alternatives that we can do. So the first one is, let's just leverage the existing tools capabilities. Maybe I'm going in the CloudTrail and I'm running a handful of queries manually. Not ideal, I know, but it'll get the job done. Maybe we're leveraging APIs. We write a Python script to go and make a query for us, and then take that query information and maybe that subset of data that we've just filtered out with our query, and then only ingest that into our SIM. So we could use, firewall management system has all the firewall logs. So if I want to do an investigation or look for an IOC, maybe if it has a search API, I can just execute my hunts against that on a routine basis. So that gets us out of having to ingest firewall logs, which are extremely of low value normally for detections because it can just be super noisy and very, very voluminous. So I could use an API. I can use the dedicated tools, as we mentioned. Maybe I'm going into GuardDuty. Maybe I'm going into the SaaS application I've purchased because it has search capability. Maybe that on-premise device stores the data for me, and then I can also use APIs to search it. And I don't have to go in and use a UI, which then would be extraordinarily manual. So a great example of being able to use this for threat hunting is an example where we made some lemonade out of lemons. So a customer of mine had several 100,000 endpoints in an EDR system that centrally stored all of its telemetry in on-premise servers. That's great. We could go in and search during investigations, but the same tool was missing detections. So what we ended up doing was writing, it had a search API and it had a search capability. So we were able to write searches, which essentially were our detection rules that we could use and execute that routinely against those servers in that data set, and then import that data into the SIM for further correlation, further analysis, and lo and behold, we immediately start finding things that this system was missing because we were able to do more behavioral detections because it didn't have its own detections language. So that's one of our alternatives. Alternative number 2, you hunt on locally stored data. And I think this one's just taken off tremendously with the introduction of Velociraptor. A tool where you can query event logs that are on hosts. You can query some of your traditional disk forensic capabilities and things that exist there. This allows you to, I don't need to store everything. I can execute my hunts routinely against data that is stored in little individual endpoints, aka all the systems or workstations in your environment. And the disks on those, even in businesses where they go, oh, well, I remember back in the day where an 80 gig disk was like, that's all they would put on a workstation, and you had plenty of storage. So if you think about today's normal size is 250 SSDs or whatever, those hosts probably have 3, 4, 5 gigs to spare to store additional endpoint logs, whatever those may be, that you could then go query later on. There's a couple of different approaches you could take there. So I mentioned Velociraptor because it can query locally stored data. We have OS query, which can store its data locally while it processes it and save it there for kind of centralized communication. Both open source tools, fairly low overhead and expense to run and operate. And there's another one that came out that I think there's probably a lot of opportunities, and some crafty individuals will have some interesting things to do with, and that is a tool called Chainsaw by F-Secure's Countercept team, where it can actually run signal rules, which was mentioned in an earlier talk. It can run signal rules against local event logs. So if you think about, I have this ability to probably start, I won't say infinite, but exponentially more logs on an individual host to query later on. Something like Chainsaw, if you could work out some scripts to execute that locally, granted it's only Windows-based, to execute that locally, you'd be able to turn out some very good detections routinely and executing against a local data store. So I think that's a really good option. And then there's option number 3, which is kind of similar a little bit to number 2. And this may be where you execute a sort of hunting capability, often referred to by professional services as a compromise assessment, depending on the size of your organization. Again, you're going to go in, maybe it's quarterly, you're going to execute your hunts against locally stored data, or a popular technique that all the good ones will use. Maybe they deploy an EDR technology, maybe some custom scripts or custom things. But what they'll do is they'll pull back a ton of locally stored, what we would consider traditional disk forensic artifacts, shim cache, app cache, maybe the registry, the MFT, for analysis and ingestion into a larger tool. This actual process was kind of originally popularized by Chris Pogue in his Sniper Forensics series. I think there's about 3 of those presentations he did. But you can take all that data, then parse it, and actually start going and looking in an environment and go, hey, what has happened in the past, bringing your threat intelligence capabilities to it. And if you're a small organization, maybe with a lot of compartmentalization, this may be a good approach where you can't store everything in the SIM because you have, a bunch of different business units. They don't like sharing data and information. You can execute your hunts potentially in this way. So you don't always need it in a SIM. So next, I need an EDR. I worked for an EDR vendor. I love EDR, and there's so many good things about it, but you don't actually need an EDR. What we need is context. I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. When you're doing a threat hunt, if you find something that is suspicious and you don't have enough data, what's your first question? Maybe, well, let's go ask the user. Maybe it was a week, 2 weeks later. They're not going to remember what popped up on their screen, maybe what emails they had read. And if they did, it's not necessary that we can always trust them, unfortunately. Because when security comes knocking on your door these days, people just panic immediately. And the answer is always, no, I didn't do that. So that's not great. So we don't need an EDR, but it happens to have a lot of context. It gives us all that pretty information and a glorious UI, process ancestry, and linkage between the processes. You can kind of see the full attack chain without going to onesie, twosie log sources. It can be done other ways. For example, I remember back in the day, I did a lot of network forensics initially because that's all we had. And then I would always say, well, if I just had the disk, I could get the answers for what was actually done on the host, not just what network communications took place. And then kind of as disk forensics matured, and then we came along with memory forensics. I was like, oh, if only I had a RAM dump, I could tell you even more information or data. Well, EDR kind of brings that all together and gives you probably about 80% of the information you need to solve your cases. but you don't need it to do threat hunts. I mean, Craig made some great points on, here's some network things that you can do, just looking at telemetry. And also the keynote mentioned the same things. So let's not get stuck up on, I have to have this specific tool to execute what I need to be an effective hunter. Excuse me. But if I don't need EDR, then what do I need? So I mentioned we need context. It's because that we don't have those historical events to remember. Like, we can't trust the users to be able to do those things and understand it. But that context can be derived from multiple data sources when combined. Combining data sets, of course, large data joins can be computationally intensive. You may not have the right tools to even do it. It can be expensive if you're doing it in systems where when you bring in data, you're scanning it or re-ingesting it. But we need those different data sources. So let's take a look at what data sources we need and what kind of context they could potentially provide, because we could execute hunts against all of them. So here are some contextual data sources. And I like to use this bullseye because, and there's probably areas we could fill in between, but if you just think about it, the further away you get from the user and that user's actions, the less context you have. If you think about a network rule or a network log, all I have is source and destination pair, maybe the ports that they talked over. If I'm lucky and it's flow data and information and isn't sampled and is continuous, I might have the bytes that were transmitted, in which case then I have a lot more data and, data and information there. But that's like really far away from the user, unless it's on their local firewall, which is extraordinarily rare. So let's look at it. Shellcode, if you think about Shellcode, one, you can do hunts and virus total using Shellcode, but that has so much context. Sometimes it may be 50% or more of the conversation, but that shellcode, when analyzed by a good malware analyst, will tell you, hey, it's waiting for this code. When it sees this code, it's going to do these actions. It has these behaviors. I can use that data and information to go look at my other pieces of telemetry to go find it. I can go scan other files maybe that came in my environment. Shellcode is very powerful, not only to hunt on, but to use to power hunting. And it also answers a lot of the questions you need. So if you get the host and you don't have a lot of logs, but you get the malware, now you may have a lot more information. Of course, then just having the malware with no logs, you may only be able to say, well, this is what the source, the malware was capable of. Did it happen? I don't know. Probably, absolutely, depending on how long it's been there, if you can tell. We step away one ring outside of the bullseye, right? The direct target. And we end up with operating system events. And this could be audit the information. It could be, sysmon logs. It could be Windows event logs. A lot of EDRs are collecting what could be considered operating system events because they're tied into APIs and they're feeding that data and information back to us. One more layer out, we have the application logs. So application logs are going to give us things that could be useful, but they're very, very specific. So IIS, Nginx logs will have, maybe the HTTP codes and maybe the URL or the data that was posted, depending on how much logging was turned on there. That's only part of the conversation. So again, we'll have some context of maybe what happened, but if we don't go that layer deep, we don't have any operating system things like, oh yeah, they, there was a buffer overflow in the web server. We see that in the web server logs. After that, we don't know what happened because we don't have the context. If we don't have the shellcode or we don't have the operating system events to go that layer deeper. And then last but not least, having network level information. Again, I mentioned that it's not super context rich, but it can provide us with a tremendous amount of value depending on what we're using it for. If we have bytes in, bytes out, it's contiguous and not sampled, we could at least tell you, all right, there was a lot of exfiltration from this host. But from a context value, it's like, yeah, I don't know what it was talking to, what processes, what machines. I just know that, it went to this source and this destination. What they actually transmitted, I don't know, but it was a lot. So we have that. So now onto the mistakes. And this is one that I think is driven and made quite frequently. And when I was talking to customers and when I talked to some of my peers, is using the hypothesis method to only be the standard method that they use for threat hunting. and only using it against standard data sources. So you think about PowerShell, you know, a lot of the common conversations be like, oh, APT X, Y, and Z uses PowerShell with these switches. I'm going to create a hunt, go look at my entire environment, all my PowerShell logs, and go look for evidence that that has occurred because we don't have any detections for it today. So going back there, I don't think that, that's the best use of our methodologies. And I have multiple methodologies I like to approach threat hunting with. Hypothesis is just one of them. But when you think about hypothesis-driven hunting, where everyone should really be focused on is, for lack of a better way to put it, where's the crown jewels? Every single business I've ever worked at has had some very specialized system that was core to their intellectual property. It was core to how they got there today, the way their business operated. It could be anything. It could be a custom IAM system. It could be a custom financial system for trading. It could be seating charts and ticketing systems. There are many things that make your business go round and round that were probably built in-house by a bunch of programmers a long, long time ago. And it's 10, depending on your industry, it's 10 or 20 years older or older and has just been kind of hobbled along and enabled to continue to run and maybe added IP functionality. So then where should we focus? Those are the tools we should be focused on. But here's the problem. 9 times out of 10, you're probably not going to have what you want. Like we just talked about some high context, high value logs. If it's an old archaic application, it may not even be running on Windows or Linux. It may be on some, old COBOL programmer, mainframe, AS400 kind of stuff. But what could we look for if we did have some things, or what would we want to hunt on? Well, some good starting points, which we could work with those teams who built those tools, might be something as simple as API logs. Do they log authentications to said system? Is there even an authentication mechanism to this system? Who accesses it and how? Those are very, very basic. And more than likely, none of this stuff's going to exist. Or if they do have some of those, it's going to be in a debug build that sits in quality assurance and doesn't actually go into production, in which case we're kind of in trouble here. So what can we do? Well, again, using our kind of concentric bullseye circles, we can start with the network level information. That'll at least give us who's talking to this system and when, over what ports or protocols, what times, and kind of start to develop, unfortunately, a baseline. But this baseline would help us establish who's talking to it, when and how, from what systems, to maybe start doing some statistical analysis and saying, hey, this host just came in and we haven't seen him in 30 days or 31 days or 42 days, because that's all the data we have. He's new. What's he doing here? What ports or protocols is he trying to talk over? But if we don't have that, we might have some other pieces. I mentioned API logs. Maybe if it's running on a web server because it's a web app, we may have the web server logs, so we can kind of start to create some more context with the network logs, who's talking to it, doing some joins of those data to say, well, what codes are they using? What response codes are they getting? Asking those kinds of questions and getting that kind of information. Statistical analysis is really going to help us there. But first, we have to figure out all those pieces and points where we can kind of pull little bits and pieces out of that. And one thing to consider too is if we don't have access to those, maybe, just maybe, you could get full PCAP off of that, those systems, or destined to those systems off of some edge service, hopefully non-SSL encrypted. If it's a big app, maybe it's not behind a load balancer or something and they're stripping SSL for you, you can get the raw, in which case then you can actually create from there using like Zeek or something. You could get DNS logs and data and information from various different protocols that are flowing back and forth from that system to at least give you some sort of enablement, even if it talks in a proprietary protocol. So great opportunities, but super difficult to do, and the business really has to want to do it. So maybe maturity level might be a bit much there, but definitely something worth trying. Here's another mistake. As hunters or people selling hunting services, only executing a hunt once is a tremendous mistake. As mentioned earlier in a talk, threat hunts, ultimate end output should be a detection mechanism. I did it once, I cared about it enough to do it once. Why would I only do it once? Because I created a hypothesis or I had a methodology that said, this is important. This could or did happen in my environment. Why wouldn't I want to go look for it all the time and have a permanent detection capability? But if it can't become a detection, because sometimes we mentioned massive data joins, manually culling data and bringing it in to create a hunting package, if you will, or being able to have enough data and information to create context to hunt over. Those kinds of things just aren't easy to do. But a detection, I like to call them detection methods, is when we're bringing all that data in. If it can't become an automated detection, put in the SIM and put somewhere where a SOC analyst will have enough context to be able to use it, that detection method should be run on a regular occurrence. Now, I said earlier that we're doing this threat hunting for identifying new TTPs, but also to reduce dwell time. If you're trying to reduce dwell time, the time in between implementing those detection methods or executing those mini hunts, if you will, those detection methods on a regular occurrence is what's going to minimize your dwell time. So I like to do it every week as a bare minimum, but I understand that not all businesses are created equal or may have those opportunities. You're probably clawing and fighting your management for opportunities to do threat hunts, but so maybe it's once a quarter. Still, once a quarter, that's better than once a year or never. So we could potentially reduce that dwell time from, only seeing it once or having the opportunity to see it once because we ran it once and then never doing that again. So bear that in mind. Detection should be your first priority. A detection method should be your second priority, and then implementing that detection method on some sort of regular cadence. So here's a common problem we get stuck in our heads, our mistake as threat hunters. Like, my outputs aren't relevant to the business. The SOC team, they care about it. Me and my team, we care about it. We're awesome. We're doing good things. This is hard work. It's important. But thinking that it's not relevant is all too common because you're asking for money. You're asking for something, you're asking for time. You're asking for something that you hope yields a big fat goose egg, 0 results. If you go to your management and tell them, I need $500,000 in, extra storage and SIM, whatever it is, so I can execute threat hunts on a regular basis and hopefully find badness, and you don't find anything because you're lucky, and you're doing everything right from your security controls and all that, you have to still be able to show value, that the reason why you're doing this and how you're pushing your business forward. And that's really difficult. So selling it, you always have to be selling and capturing that value. And let's take a quick look and see how we could do that. So there are a few things. So the outcomes are the things that you as a hunter and your team probably care about. Documenting internal anomalies and knowledge so that the people who come after you, or if someone else executes that hunt, they know what normal might be, or that Jim in accounting runs this script once a month. And so that if it pops up to a new person on the team, they don't panic. Identifying missing or required telemetry, AKA, hey, we couldn't finish this hunt because we lacked the data we need, or the data was insufficient. Newly acquired threat intelligence, atomic or behavioral indicators and behaviors there. Now, the things you need to sell to your management should be the measurements, right? All management love, I like to call it eye candy. So pretty pie charts, bar graphs, give them something to look at that they can put in a slide that goes up to the CISO or whatever. Those would be the number of hunts you've executed. This is an easy one, depending on your frequency and cadence, size of your team. This may be a lot, it may be a little. The number of new detections that came out of those. So started a hunt, it moved on and progressed. We created detections for it. Boom, that's automatically going into improving our security posture. Maybe the number of new detection methods, because again, that cadence for those, if it's once a week, eventually that becomes a little overhead intensive depending on how long they take to execute and analyze and do. So that will grow over time, but hopefully you can keep a handle on it. Number of detections you tuned. So if you did a PowerShell hunt for a new switch or capability because you didn't have any detections for it currently, well, we're going to increase or change this PowerShell detection to add these other switches or create a brand new one. So you may just tune something to add it to a rule versus creating an entirely new one. The last 3 are probably the biggest. Number of hosts you hunted against, depending on how you're executing your hunts in your environment. This is going to be a hard one because having a lot of hosts to hunt over, 100,000, maybe 10,000. You may be doing the compromise assessment methodology. I'm only looking at this business unit, and that's 5,000 people. So we hunted against 5,000 hosts. Well, that's great. What were the results from that hunt? Because results equal analytical time. Analytical time equals humans. Humans take time to do these things, right? So the number of hosts I've hunted against, how many I investigated. If I went from 5,000 in the hunt to I had to look at 50 hosts, if that was an hour a piece, there's a week. So you have to be able to capture this to show the workload, show the effort, and also show the value. And last but not least, and I hope that you aren't running into things regularly, but if you are, what was the dwell time? Great example, going back to one of my earlier slides, that EDR platform would miss a coin miner beaconing. We could try and trace back, okay, it landed on the host on this day, AV missed it, or maybe only grabbed the secondary payload, but then the primary changed. So it was able to continue to operate. What was the dwell time there? Because we all can go to point to the average. If we're doing better than average, we can all pat ourselves on the back because one, we didn't make it in the news, and two, we found it before it got out of control, hopefully. So dwell time reduction is always awesome. Thank you.